Good morning, everybody. It's good to see a lot of people racing into this webinar. That was pretty quick. We already have, close to 20 people already in the room as we open up. Good to see all of you coming in, and very good morning to this data visualization masterclass with my four guests, who I'll introduce shortly. But very good to have everybody here. As you come in, please, in the chat, if you've done a few of these with me, you'll know the little pet rule I have of mine is, let us know your name, which business you're calling from. If you're outside South Africa, let us know as well. As you do that, I wonder when Zoom is going to fix this. Please make sure you select all panelists and attendees in the chat to post your message. So remember to select all panelists and attendees. This will allow all of us to interact with you and to allow our attendees and our panelists as well to see your message. So ensure you select all panelists and attendees. Good morning, Val. Great to have you. Good morning, Esti. Good to have you today. And I see you're going by all panelists and attendees as requested. So thank you very much. We are quickly rising in numbers. We're hitting close to the 40 mark. It's a very good turnout already. And as I just said to the early birds, the guys that literally ran in as I opened the room, that please select all panelists and attendees and tell us in the chat, tell us your name, which business you're coming from. And if you're outside South Africa or even outside Johannesburg, let us know. Let us know where you are. It'll be good to know where the bulk of the people that are attending this data visualization masterclass are tuning in from. So we're really excited to have you. I'm not surprised we've got team members from Standard Bank, from Sage, from Mars that are going to join us today. So it's very, very good to have all of you here. I'm going to quickly just give you what the expectations are for the day. And just a quick check on the numbers. Yes, the numbers are looking good. So a quick check again today. This is a data visualization masterclass, finance visibility lessons from Standard Bank, Sage, and Mars Africa. So to kick us off, we will do, as I've already started, the intro and the welcome. And for a change, we will have a two-set panel discussion today, so we can unpack today's agenda. And at the end, we will squeeze in a Q&A section. I know I say squeeze in because we've got absolute data gurus on the call here. So if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat as we go along with the conversation. Let us know questions, challenges that you're having in the business. Perhaps I can post it to my panelists. So we're looking good for numbers, and I'm really excited to see a lot of people all here. Please remember to select all panelists and attendees. It's very important that we can all engage, all panelists and attendees, when you post a message in the chat so we can all see it. Thank you, Gavin from Mondi, and good morning, Dineo, as well as Angele Tlamini, who have joined us as well. Really excited to have everybody come onto this call. So as the age of big data kicks into higher gear, visualization is an increasingly key tool to make sense of the trillions of rows of data generated every year and every day, really. So data visualization helps tell stories by curating data into a form of easier to understand, highlighting the trends and the outliers. Data visualization tools and technologies are essential to analyze massive amounts of information and make data-driven decisions. And this is key. I emphasize the data-driven decisions. The data and the visuals need to work together. However, there is an art at combining great analysis and great storytelling. So welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Data Visualization Masterclass. My name is Brian. I'm the community manager at CFO South Africa. Today, I'll be joined by Gerhard, who's the VP of Medium Business from Sage. I'll also have Mohammed, also from Sage. He's a product marketing director. And then we'll get key learnings from Nicole Daniels, who's Metrics Insights head at Standard Bank. And then we'll also bring in Sam Hopwood, who's the CFO at Mars. So very good to have you. So without further ado, I would like to get us started. I see we've got a good audience here. And with that, given this is a webinar brought to you by Sage, I'd like to call in the VP of Medium Business, Gerhard, to sort of open up the platform for us. Gerhard, when you're ready, you can turn on your camera. You can perhaps say hello. And as you do that, I'll lead off with your question for us to get the ball rolling. So to lay the foundation from a business point of view, what does visualization mean? Is it true that visualization of data can support a narrative better than a table of numbers? So Gerhard, over to you to kick us off. Thank you.
Good morning, Brian. It's great to be on your show, like always. It's also fantastic to see all the participants joining. So thank you for coming on board. And as you said, it's going to be a great masterclass. And I think very importantly at the end, as you highlighted, we would like to take some questions and answers. Just maybe quick reference, Sage, if you don't know us, we're a provider of accounting, HR, finance, and people software in South Africa and beyond on the African continent. And very importantly, part of that is how do you look at data? And from a Sage perspective, what we've seen over the past couple of years, it changes on a regular basis. And you referenced big data, and you referenced and said, but what do you want to see? And I think that's very important. The way we looked at data a few years ago versus the way we looked at it before COVID, during COVID, and today is completely different. When we look at data visualization, and again, I'm going to reference the market, you said tell a story. It's so important because what is the story? The story is the business. What does a business want to do? The business wants to understand internally, is there anything we can better in a process? But the business also wants to understand their customers. And again, when we look at data visualization, it's important to define your roles. It's important to define what would you like to see. And then from there, you touched on data-driven decisions. That's going to be the end game, to say we've automated this visualization. And now we can make better decisions. And I mean, everyone on the call represents their own organization. And very importantly is you need to look at what do you want to visualize? Because it's not a small task. It's not a quick fix. It's a journey that you go on. But very importantly on that journey, to make sure that you keep changing your recipe, that you keep on making sure you achieve your strategic goals that you've put down for your organization.
Thanks, Gerhard, for laying that. And you make an interesting point there. You said that data-driven decisions is the end game. And I just want to follow up with that, and I'll bring in Mohammed quickly on that. So Mo, Gerhard has said data-driven decisions is the end game, but can you perhaps, because you're working inside the business with teams and finance professionals, etc., what should data visualization mean per job function? And I'm speaking perhaps specifically for financial professionals.
Yeah, morning, Brian, and good morning to everyone on the call. It's great to be with you guys this morning. So, it's a very pertinent question that you asked there, Brian, because this is something that we often engage with customers on a regular basis across the board. Typically you would think that the CFO is the custodian of data, especially when it comes to financial data. But we find in today's times with with cloud adoption that is sort of being taken widely by many businesses, operational data is also quite important. And what's important, to understand is that CFOs have long been encouraged to become better storytellers. We talk of storytelling because really that's what data visualization is really evolving into. You can have all of this data, but what does this data mean? How do you translate this data into something meaningful, and who is your audience? And by understanding who your audience is, and you are able to then take those metrics and actually then depict the story that they need to understand to make the decisions. Because often you find that the people that analyze these visualizations and dashboards, graphs and maps, etc., they know what they know in terms of their business area. But often when the data is coming through, they can't make sense of the data. It's quite a bit of data. So you've got to find the beneficial features of what the data is, as you probably would have a data analyst that is able to get mine all of the data. Then he will present the data and is a custodian of the data for that business operation, be it the CFO, be it the sales VP, be it the production manager, etc. You would then understand and say, okay, let's make sense of this data, and then narrate the story to your audience, be it the board, be it the general public, or be it someone that you're asking funding from. You need to be able to give them the story of what is it that your business is doing, how is it performing, is it meeting the KPIs, what are the trends and outliers in terms of that data, and so then you are able to sort of narrate the story. So that's really what it's come to. Data by itself doesn't mean anything until you're able to tell the story of what it's actually trying to depict.
Yeah, and that's interesting. And I think a lot of time we forget that data really doesn't mean anything unless you've kind of defined what it is that you want to do. And Gerhard, I'm going to call you back quickly. So now, you've given us what data visualization means to a business. What should we do with our current structures? Should we pack away our spreadsheets or move to digital already, just because perhaps our competitors are doing? What are some of the pitfalls to avoid, once you are on this data visualization track?
Yes, Brian, Mo touched on it, but I think to take a step back, when we look at data visualization, as you said, first step is what would you like to achieve? And Mo referenced a role of the CFO. Mo referenced the fact that there's strategic priorities in an organization. Now, if you said Excel or spreadsheets versus graphs right in the beginning, and I mean, I'm gonna talk about myself. I'm a visual type of person. So for me, when looking at data, when I see it in graph formats, immediately it tells a story. And from there, if you want to unpack the detail, you need to have the functionality to draw deeper into the metrics to say what it makes sense. But if we bring it back to a customer or business, if you ask yourself, what do you want to achieve? Because at the end of the day, you can digitalize. So let's say you don't have systems in place, whether you're a small company or a big multinational. I saw a few on the call. You must ask yourself, where do we start? What is the burning point in the organization we want to fix? Do we want to fix that with visualization of data? And if you have that answer, then the next step will be, let's unpack that burning point and let's bring in solutions to give us the end result of the dashboard or the intel on the data. And again, it ties back to a role. So a CFO can say, listen, I've got certain KPIs I need to meet. How many, what's our top 5 products selling? What is our top 5 accounts owing? And maybe that is KPIs. How's our cash flow looking? It really depends from business to business. But visualizing and automating that process is part of your digital journey. And let's stop there. But it's important that you get that process done. Also important, when you are looking at automating or digitalizing or visualizing your data, understand what your customer needs are. Understand what is customers externally, but customers internally, the people that's going to work with us. Make them part of that process. And then redefining it and adapting it every time your business changes. because the way you looked at data last year versus how you want to predict now going forward is different.
And I like that. I think what I'm picking from that, Gerhard, is you're removing the noise from the data and highlighting just the useful information, right? But this is not easy, and I wanna again go to Mohammed quickly. And Mohammed, so is a delicate data visualization is a balance between form and function, right? So when we last spoke, you mentioned that it is important that to consider the nature of your visualizations, right? Is the information conceptual or is it data driven? Am I declaring something or am I exploring something? Share some insights on that. I mean, how do you discern that conceptual, data driven, exploration? Give us a sense of what would that look like for a business.
Sure. So Brian, I think there's a couple of things. Firstly, to remove the noise. That's a very important point, because you get so much of data. What part of the data is actually the relevant data, and who is the audience? So typically, what the steps that are involved in terms of trying to understand is to understand who's your audience. And based on that data, you are then able to choose the right data and the visualizations around that, so that you can draw their attention to the key information. And on that basis, then develop a narrative that can be engaging to your audience. Now, with that, you get two types. You get what we refer to generally as exploratory data visualization. And this is really just in the data analysis phase. So what this means really is that you've got a whole lot of data, right? But you don't know what to do with this data. You don't know what this data actually means. So you have to sort of trawl through the data, understanding what is the identifiable features, so that you can understand the trends, the outliers, and the patterns that this data is basically showing. And then in contrast to that, you get what we refer to generally in the industry, explanatory data visualization. And so the one is exploratory, the other one is explanatory. And explanatory comes back to what we're talking about, the storytelling. And storytelling is a big thing. It's coming across the industry, whether you're doing a presentation from a marketing perspective, whether you're doing analysis of the business from a strategic perspective. It's all about how you narrate the story. Okay, we're also getting into the point from a software development perspective, when you're developing the UI and how you sort of develop functionalities. They expect you to now narrate the story. So you've got to give a storyline as to who the client is, what they're doing, what is it that you're trying to achieve. And similarly, when it comes to data visualizations, when you have to make these decisions, if you, for example, a public company or you're an NPO, we often see this with NPOs, but we've got a fair amount of NPOs that utilize our software as well. They have to, go and garner donors to give them grants so that they can carry out the necessary work. And it's not just about presenting the data. It's about how you narrate the story. What is the emotional aspect of what you're doing in your business that actually appeals then to the donor, and then they'll say, okay, great, we're going to give you the funding. So really, it's about then developing the narrative around the data to say, okay, this is what the data is representing. This is what we're sort of achieving in the business, and this is how we sort of look to take the business forward. And once you can articulate that information to the right stakeholders, you get their buy-in, and hopefully you get the right decisions coming out of that.
Well, I'm going to stick with you for a bit, but I'm going to move to kind of sort of key people capabilities, right? What type of people do you need, and what's the responsibility, I suppose, from a business point of view, to ensure that the teams are producing the right data and the right visuals that are usable for various, for sales, marketing, finance, etc. Right? Because often just mining data is a job in itself, right? But now we talk about, now you got to put the visuals, which again becomes a job. So what type of people are we creating, like a new role? What kind of skill sets do we need to embed? Does it take time? Give us a sense of that. And then perhaps I'll pass that question as well to Gerhard afterwards and get his view.
Yeah, absolutely. I was at the end of last year, my nephew is looking, he was going to studying into varsity this year, and he was asking me for some advice in terms of what are the career options in the 21st century that we should be looking at. And having done a bit of research and so forth, one of the things that stood out was the data scientist. And I'm sure this term must have been heard often by various people, and often it sounds very fancy. What exactly is a data scientist? But I just want to, before I even explain that point, IDC had done a survey called Directions 2021. And in that survey, there were obviously, surveys in customers globally as well as in our region. And, we sort of work with them quite closely. And the survey results, was quite interesting because a lot of customers, since the advent of COVID, a lot of customers have decided to accelerate their digital transformation by at least 1 year in advance. So, even though they've had the planning, they've actually accelerated this by at least 1 year because of the circumstances that COVID brought about. And what was interesting was that 44% of those surveyed had indicated that data now plays an important role in them making decisions. So clearly you can see there's a shift in people's minds and how they operate and what they do. And so this, begs the question as to how do you then do this? So you've got all this data, you might have multiple systems, you've got a CRM system, you've got a production system, you've got a finance system, you've got an HR and payroll system. And those individual systems will most likely give you, reports and to somewhat an extent dashboards and interactive visual reports as to how, around key metrics that you would probably expect from the solution. But from an overall perspective, if you're sitting at a board level and you're not necessarily interacting with those individual products, you want to have an overall view of what's happening in the business. And so you've got to get someone that's able to extract that data. So that's, the term of data scientists, data analysts comes about, where these people understand the back-end data sources. They're then able to pull that information from these data sources and make sense of that into what we refer to generally as a data warehouse. Okay, and in some instances also referred to as a container. So the data warehouse is a central location where you're pulling all these different sources of data into a central location. And now you're starting to make sense to say, okay, let's create a CFO dashboard or a CEO dashboard. And this gives you a quick snapshot of what's happening in the business in terms of operations, finances, profitability, HR, headcount, etc. So that's the typical role that you would require. Someone who's more of a technical nature that understands the SQL databases, the Oracle databases, etc., to pull this stuff into a central location. And then, coming back, once you are able to depict that information in a visual format, it's about the custodian of that data. So for example, if you work in HR, you then got to make sense of the data, understand the data, and then, create the narrative to explain this to the rest of the teams on whatever you're trying to depict to the company.
All right, thanks for that, Mohammed. And I said, Gerhard, I wanted to get your insights as well, from a capabilities point of view and producing the right data, ensuring that you're being agile, and you're not spending a lot of time just mining the data that's not usable, right? And before you put it out into this data visualization charts that we all like to see on the walls.
Yes, I mean, as I said, on the walls, the visuals on the wall is the end game. But before that, to what Mo referenced is, I mean, there's a lot of work that needs to take place. And again, I want to bring it back to data as power, data as decision-making, data is real time. Mo mentioned data warehousing, lot of systems integrations, etc. And that's again part of your plan. How do you define what data you need from which system, have all of that consolidated to give you the full picture? And again, the roles within the organization, the pictures are going to be different. The role of the CFO, what they want to measure within the organization, not just inside of it, looking at the financials, but looking at the trends in the market, have predictive data, and that's where a lot of analysis, market analysis Mo referred to, comes in. So what is the prediction we're going to make? Do we need to change our product to adapt to our new audience? That's the power of data visualization and data dashboards. It's not just looking back, it's predicting trends, it's making assumptions of the future to recourse and redirect your organization to be the best in your industry. And that's the power when you get that recipe right. And I think everyone always, you say, what is the guidance? What is the points we can put down? Firstly, as I said right in the beginning, the vision you want to achieve. Practically, what would you like to automate if there's a burning point? Making sure you have predictive analysis, building the skill internally in your organization, and making sure you future-proof your organization at the end of the day to be able to adapt to the trends, to the prediction, to the future. Because it's always changing. And that's where your software vendors come in. That's where your service providers comes in to make sure they can change that visualization with you, and that you have that future proofing to make sure you stay in business.
Awesome. I like that. I've a couple of statements I've heard. Future proofing, it's always changing, and you got to stay on top of it. With that, Gerhard and Mo, I'm going to give you guys a little break. I want to call on our pros from the two businesses. I'm going to call on Nicole from Standard Bank to the podium, and I'll bring in Sam Hopwood as well. So Nicole, just a quick introduction. Please tell us who you are and what you do, and then perhaps you can open up with what is data visualization? What does that mean at Standard Bank? And just take us some of your typical practices.
Thanks, Brian. And thanks everyone for inviting me to this wonderful session. I think I'm very passionate about this topic, and it brings great joy when we can have a forum like this to actually explore new thinking, new ideas, and just to also integrate, I guess, where we all are in the different spheres of our journey, as Gerhard mentioned earlier in the discussion. So I'm Nicole Daniels. I'm in the group reporting team at Standard Bank, heading up metrics, insights, and analysis. And really what that entails is for us to understand how we're looking at our metrics and how we're positioning that across the organization. So in Standard Bank, we are guided in our reporting by our strategic value drivers. So it's actually a hypothesis that we look at, which is called client focus plus our employee experience plus risk and conduct and operationally excellent will lead us to, if we deliver those four key things, it will lead us to good financial outcome and our social, economic, and environmental impact to the societies in which we operate in. So very often that is how we're guided when we tell our story, when we think about reporting, in the flow of the data, etc. So Brian, yes, that is me, just on a high level on what I do. From a Standard Bank perspective, and I know quite often when we talk about data visualization, it's always something that finance teams want to be proactive around, we want to work towards, we want to do it yesterday, but there's always something holding us back. And I think it's quite important that we acknowledge the background around that. And it's really just because finance teams, more often than not, are inundated with a very high volume of work. And that high volume of work generally requires a lot of manual intervention to display information, either through Excel or spreadsheets, as you like to call them, Brian, or PowerPoint. And I think, between Mo and Gerhard, they've really articulated the need for us to start digitizing and automating. So I think when we, and specifically in our team, when we look at data and visualization, there's a very key flow that we follow. The first thing we look at as our first principle is the team and I always strive to understand how do we maximize our data automation processes using agile principles. So this really means, Brian, how do we look at all the data that we require to do the reporting and ensure that the gaps of automation are filled as far as possible to limit the amount of manual intervention. Once we do that, our second step is then to go to the experts of this data to really understand and articulate what this data is telling us in terms of storylines so that we can derive insights and analysis from it. And only then do we actually build our data visualization. So for us, it's so important to first understand why we're doing the piece of work, what are we trying to deliver with this piece of work, and then only to develop the visualization behind it.
Awesome, thank you for that, Nicole. Sam, I'm going to come to you, perhaps with the same kind of flow to just kick us off. Just tell the audience who you are, what is data visualization at Mars, and give us a key sense of some of the things that you're doing.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, good morning, everybody. So I'm Sam, I'm the CFO for Mars Africa. Mars Africa, in case you don't know, is a consumer goods company. So we have a wide range of global brands across portfolios in pet care, in chocolate, in food portfolio, and in chewing gum. So, you know, the data is obviously extremely important to us. Just to reiterate what everyone else has said, which is that data is there and used to help us make better and quicker decisions. That's what it comes down to. What does data visualization to me? I mean, we'll go into a lot more detail, I think, in the next 15 minutes or so, but ultimately it's around keeping things very simple. It's around driving insights, and it's about being user-centric so that the user can really benefit from the data. So what that means is not starting with the data and saying, okay, we can make a nice visualization of this data, but actually start at the end and say, what are the questions that the user is going to want to answer? What is the user really want to see in order to help them with their decision making, and then work backwards to get into a position where all of the data can be collated from the different systems, as everybody said, and help to inform that decision.
Thanks for that, Sam. I'm going to call Nicole back quickly. Nicole, you know, it's the old adage, right? They say, you know, rubbish in, rubbish out, or something like that, right? So you give us a sense, like, you know, the right visualization brings the data to life, right? But the wrong one can confuse your point, right? You can have the prettiest charts, but if they're not making the right sense, they could be confusing to a lot of your teams. So what are your must-haves and the lookouts when you're sharing your metrics and insights and analysis to ensure that what you're displaying as a visualization is actually generating or leading to actionable behaviors?
Thanks, Brian. And I think, you know, the question you raised is so crucial and can be answered from so many different angles, really. And like I said, I think at the beginning of this, I am quite passionate about this topic. So I might need you to stop me if I go overboard here. I think for us, just on principles or practices that we use when we're looking at data and visualization. Again, to Sam's point and the point I raised in the previous question, it's really with the end user in mind. So when we look at anything, we really try to understand what is the end user looking for, what do they need, and how do we answer that in the best possible way. And I think one of the key things that I've learned over the last few years is how do you produce data visualization in a way where you don't actually need a presenter to present the information to the audience? How does the visualization actually speak for itself? How does your digital dashboarding be so intuitive, so flexible, so that anyone that picks it up and uses it is able to leverage off the information, and it's able to tell them some very key insights into decisions that could potentially influence some of the discussions that are happening at quite senior levels. So I think for us, that's extremely, extremely important. The other point for us, Brian, is how do you use the data to actually influence decisions? I think, you know, sometimes we use these words and they're not really explanatory to everyone. And maybe just if I can highlight an example of what we try to do at Standard Bank, is we use a lot of in finance, I think the go-to is always to use financial data. And financial data to a business CE might not always be as intuitive as it is to us who are finance people. So what we've tried to do over the last few months or year is really look at what are the lead indicators. How do we use lead business indicators to understand what has happened in that business space? And then that has then led to the outcome of the financial performance. And in that way, and in doing that, and in telling our story in that manner, it's really helped not just finance to tell the story better, but business to understand the rewards and the insights that can be derived from the data that has been positioned to them on an ongoing basis.
Thanks for that, Nicole. Sam, I'm going to call you in first, and I remember I recall this being mentioned a couple of times earlier with, data visualization should be in the CFO's toolkit. But as any tool, right, it is only as good as the user. Give us a sense of fundamentals at play at Mars specifically to ensure that data visualization, and perhaps to Nicole's point, is creating value in your business.
Sure, thanks. So it's an interesting one because when I think about this, I also think just as much about behaviors and everything else than just the visualizations itself. So if you think about the toolkit, the first thing is to demonstrate in a meaningful way based on the purpose, based on the user, as we said. So for example, if I'm looking at a end of month review, then I would want to see a very detailed P&L. I don't necessarily want to see a bridge or a strong visual. Whereas then when we go to the rest of the business, then that maybe reverses on its head. But I think with that, whether you have a lot of data or a small amount of data, for me, it's around, and I challenge my team with this quite often, is how do you describe the financial performance without using any numbers? Which is an interesting one because we're very good at weather reporting. So if we put up a slide with a visual, we'll say this number, and just almost read out the graph, right? So how do you tell the story with no numbers? Or alternatively, if you have a very large data set, you say, how do you tell your story using only one number? And the reason we do that is it means that we really have to think about what the most important and the key message really is. So for me, I suppose when you talk about toolkit or skill set, it's really just as much as it is about creating visuals, it's also around understanding and being able to interpret the data, which gives the best story and the highest impact.
All right, and as a CFO, I mean, you're CFO of Mars, large business. There is gazillions of data that you need to deal with from finance, operational data, etc. And human error, right? Inevitably, there could be some inaccurate data, incomplete data, which may lead to incomplete or flawed visualizations. How are you getting it right to ensure that this copious amount of data is the truth?
Okay, so I'm not necessarily sure we are getting it right, but let us give you some things that we're doing to, let's say, cope with data integrity ultimately, which I think is an issue for many businesses. The first thing I would say is to really understand your data in terms of the workflows, but in terms of the limitations as well. So if I give you some examples where, for example, a cost is booked into the system at the highest level, which is kind of the business level, and then is allocated down. So if you were to look at a brand level P&L or a product P&L, then you have to understand that cost is part of that P&L, but it's not completely attributed to a product or an action or a decision. So you just need to really understand what data is lying where in your system and what it truly means. I think that therefore helps you to say, okay, this part of the data is investment grade, and this part of the data is we need to take with a pinch of salt, or we need to understand what it truly means. Two phrases that we use in Mars quite frequently, or I tend to use it in Mars quite frequently. The first one is when we're looking at kind of, let's say, forecasting or future data. And I say the only thing that we know is that it's definitely wrong, right? If any forecast, it's always wrong. So with that in mind, we say, okay, cool, let's look at the principles and the assumptions that we've used to really get to that number. And that allows us to have a much more robust conversation. So rather than in a couple of months, we say, oh, we said it was 3% and it's actually 2%. We're able to say, okay, we took an assumption that currency was going to impact us in this way, but it actually hasn't. And it allows us to readjust. The second thing we say is it's better to be roughly right than accurately wrong. And the reason we say that is in finance, we usually are the types of people that are perfectionists. We like to make sure that everything is perfect. And in the world of data, nothing is ever 100% or perfect. And therefore we can waste a huge amount of time and even block ourselves from making any progress or any decisions because we're waiting to get from 99% to 100% data accuracy. So we've said, okay, let's try and be roughly right. Let's get to the 80 and 90% accuracy very quickly. And that allows us to make more agile, decisions, quicker decisions, better decisions, which help us to improve business performance. So to answer your question, inaccurate data is always going to be there. It's important that we really understand the data and we're able to act on the data that we have in a robust way.
I'm going to call on Nicole, but just before I do that, just to speak to the attendees quickly. Great conversation going on. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and select all panelists and attendees so we can engage that question. We've got quite some time left with us, 15 minutes or so. So great time to start posting your questions in the chat. And if you can, even let us know who you're directing it to, so the panelists can pick it up as we go. So Nicole, I'm going to come back. I'm going to come to you quickly, and perhaps on the same point. And data integrity is, you're at the bank, and it's super important, right? How are you ensuring that you're working with the right data, in your daily data visualization practices?
Thanks, Brian. I think, as Sam said, I think we're all kind of in the same boat when it comes to data integrity and just usability as well. So it is really tough, and we're at the forefront of designing dashboards and designing these visualization tools for the board, for our group executive committee, and the level and the amount of data integrity that you need to have, as you can imagine, is quite high. We spend a lot of time and a lot of focus on ensuring that the numbers are correct, that they are in line with our expectations. And I guess that is why storytelling becomes really important. Is if you know what has actually happened in your business and you understand the drivers and how that impacts your business. So you build those correlations. And it's not always easy because you don't always have all the data, but you use the data that you do have to about an 80% level of accuracy, I think, in most instances, especially when you're looking at analysis and insights, sort of using that 80-20 rule. So if you're applying that rule and you're trying to create the correlations between what your data sets are actually telling you, you can imply a storyline. And only once you have that storyline, then when you look at the numbers that actually output from the machine, you can imply whether this is fairly accurate or maybe it's not telling the right story that you're looking for. I think we're all inundated with the problem of data integrity, and we have to find very short-term solutions at the moment of how we'll deal with it and how we'll manage it and how we'll take it forward. And we're consistently looking at ways to improve our data integrity through mining it, through curation processes, especially in the metrics world. And I think especially for us in finance, in the non-financial metric world. I think the financials are quite well established. Our general ledger and our finance systems are quite well governed. Whereas the non-financial metrics, so the hypothesis that I spoke about earlier, that's where we generally enter some sort of data integrity and automation issues. And our focus now is on that piece of work.
So Nicole, I'm going to stay with you quickly. And I know some of your team members are here. And we're just going to go back to that people question, right? What are your day-to-day expectations with your data visualization from your team members that are here? What are you expecting them to put up every day? Pretty bright colors? Are they all blue? Tell us, give us a sense of what that looks like as Standard Bank.
Wow, yeah, I hope my team has left the call already. You know, I think in a lot of ways, Brian, the world is moving so quickly. Data visualization as a key component of delivering our stories is moving and evolving so quickly. The one thing that I think that we all bring to the table, the team and I, every morning, just to remind ourselves that this is a journey. We don't have all the answers. We don't have all the solutions. And as long as we're open to the change and we're open to the opportunities that can present themselves, I think we're in a good space. What I expect from my team, I think I have very high expectations, sometimes a little bit more than the team can actually deliver. But I do definitely push them and push the boundaries a lot. Formats for me is completely important, Brian. If you look at something and it's appealing to you, you're more often than not willing to look a little bit deeper than that. So, to create that adoption. So we focus a lot on how does something look, what kind of formats do we use, the consistency around the formatting, the transparency of the data. So it's not just our team sort of producing these amazing dashboards and keeping it to ourselves. We share it with all the finance teams across the organization so that everyone can leverage off it. And that's some of the principles that we sort of govern ourselves on a day-to-day basis to ensure that whatever we do is not just for a small team in the group. It is actually for the benefit of the entire organization.
Thank you, Nicole. Thanks for touching on that. I was just pulling your leg a little bit. But on that note, if we still have any of your team members on the call, this is a fantastic time for them to ask you a question. Right live on a webinar, perhaps you'll be able to answer it. I'm just joking. But attendees, if you have a question for any of our panelists, it's a good time to start posting in the chat I'm going to call on the rest of the panelists, but before I do that, I want to go back to Sam quickly. Sam, we spoke about copious amounts of data, right? So for a CFO, is it a case of less is more, both in terms of the amount of data you reflect in your single visualization or the total number of charts and graphs that are spread across your corridors? What do you want to see? And I want to hear from a CFO's perspective, what do you want to see specifically? Does it help to know every single thing?
Yeah, thanks. This is a good question. I think something that we continue to kind of work on in terms of finding the right layers of detail that we need. My challenge, and maybe it's an unfair or unrealistic challenge to my team, is, as I mentioned, start with one number, whatever the most important number is. But we need those layers and those drill downs so that we can get to some, let's say, some answers to the questions that we will have. And let's say we stress test a lot of this in terms of the concept of 5 whys and 6 sigma, which is basically manufacturing, but it understands how to get to the root cause of a problem. So, for example, this machine's broken. Why? The engine stopped working. Why? There's no petrol in the engine. Why? Right? And then you get to the point of actually, somebody forgot to order the petrol, which is the root cause of the problem. So how do we stress test our reports and our visuals to say, okay, cool. So we are performing very well in this category. Okay, why? And we can go down and down and down in terms of level of detail and granularity to really, really get to the truth of what's driving the performance, and it allows us to make actionable decisions. So it's a vague answer. I want to start with the most high-level data, but also be able to get to the lowest level of data to answer the questions required.
Yeah, thanks for that. You've pulled a couple of terms that were quite interesting today, Sam, and I think one that's going to stick with me is the weather reporting in finance, right? That's going to be interesting for me for the next couple of sessions that I do have. But while I still have you, Sam, and before I call on the rest of the group, do you think the clock is ticking for CFOs to learn the language of visualization and finally transform it into meaningful data?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this has been on the cards for quite some time anyway. We have a huge amount of data. I'm very interested in the concepts of such things like dark data, which basically says that businesses today already have a lot of data which they're not able to use or don't know how to use properly. So businesses generally might only use 10 to 20% of the data that they have. With that in mind, you know, the step change isn't necessarily, oh, we need new fancy systems, it's just how do we get from 20% to 30% of the data that we already have today. And again, that comes down to capabilities from the finance function as well as other functions in translating the data, being able to visualize the data in a useful way to drive insights to inform decision making. It's crucially important for us as a function and for the business.
I'm going to call on Gerhard quickly and bring you back, you and Mohammed back to the podium. And so we can have perhaps a five-way conversation quickly in the last couple of minutes. But again, panelists, if you have any attendees, if you have any questions, I see some maybe started coming up. Please throw them in the chat. We can have a conversation. Gerhard, what kind of information should CFOs be receiving? Should they know everything?
Depends on the personality of the CFO. So if they more wanting to analyze everything, then yes, they're going to want to have a lot of data. But I think Sam and Nicole touched on a few points, and I made a few notes, which was general themes for me. And I think it ties back to whether you're the CFO of the organization or you're someone in the organization that need to make decisions. How do you go about it? How do you become an expert to trust the data and then to make the right decision? So the unpacking of the data, the understanding, and I think it's very easy to present data. You don't know what you're looking at. And I mean, both Sam and Nicole practically dealt with that. And I think it's very important. You need to understand it. Your workflows behind it. How do you automate things? I think we sometimes still, the human needs to do all the work, but actually you've got machine learning, AI, and it's not just to reference these buzzwords, but you can adopt technology that can automate processes that at the end of the day, the person looking at the data can use their time maybe to understanding it better and try, instead of trying to do all the manual work. And then I think the principles of the assumptions we make is key, and it needs to support the trustworthiness of that data. And then lastly, we're all in a business where we want to make decisions faster. And for me, it's like a bit of a triangle. One, understand your data, have the right skills, make sure you can build your teams. And then two, second part of the triangle is your systems in the background, that it's integrated, it talks to one another. And then lastly, keep on changing the plan. And for me, that's like a small triangle coming together when it comes to data visualization.
Yeah, thanks for that, Gerhard. Mo, I'm going to come to you now. And so you've heard it. You've heard from all these people. You are in product marketing. There's a lot of data coming out. It can't always be manual, and there are digital tools that are out there that people could use. What do you currently have in the market that's available for people to use when it comes to data visualization?
Yeah, so I mean, we've our native cloud solution, Sage Intacct, has got a couple of abilities aside from the normal dashboards you'd expect and interactive visual reports. To the point that Gerhard made earlier on around AI, just to explain why AI is so important and why this suddenly makes a difference in terms of CFOs. Typically, CFOs have always been seen as number crunchers. And yet we know that the role of the CFO is changing to become more strategic. I mean, Sam alluded to that, right? That the CFO's role is changing. Visualization has become more of a reality. But how do you get to the point that even Nicole talked about, the data integrity? How do you know that your data is, is sound, that you can rely on this data? And that's where AI comes in. We've implemented a technology in the GL that's called what we refer to as the GL outlier detector. And this effectively looks at any anomalies in your GL, and it allows the CFO to then validate these transactions. And on the basis of validating, it then sort of goes through the machine learning capabilities, understands the data and says, okay, this is correct, or it's been rejected. And so it learns through that process. But what it means is that it creates this continuous trust in your data. So you start to understand, it helps to maintain the integrity of the data to the point where you eventually understand and say, okay, I can trust this data. I don't have to trawl through the copious amounts of data. I now trust the data, and eventually the visuals that you're getting out of this really is meaningful, right? So it takes that step so that you allow, the CFO becomes more strategic in the business, as opposed to still, working in all the detail and number crunching, trying to make sure that this is actually meaningful data. I mean, if you look at, visualization, there's a psychology behind it, right? And that psychology is really that if you look at a picture, your mind takes that entire scene immediately. But if you look at, and that's how your brain processes things environmentally, right? But when you look at data in terms of like a spreadsheet or, in sort of some sort of table form, your brain first needs to understand that information, needs to comprehend that information. And then once it understands that information, it understands the context of what you're trying to do. Whereas if you look at something visually, it immediately shows you, your mind can see the increase in revenue or the dips in revenue visually. And so that suddenly just makes it easier to understand. And so, we see a big demand in data visualization, and we see that from customers. And we've had to keep up with those trends and make sure we implement those type of technologies in our native cloud solutions.
All right. Okay. Excellent. And Nicole, I'm going to bring you in quickly again. And just from, you heard it. So finance people are not number crunchers anymore. Back in the day, I used to be a finance person. How much time are you spending on this? You got to crunch the numbers, but still got to produce great data visuals at the same time. You mentioned your board, etc. But give us a sense of time. What does that mean in terms of output? You spending a lot of time pulling out the data, crunching the numbers, putting it on a dashboard. Are you using any other systems and software to do that for you? What's the interaction and what's the balance?
Thanks, Brian. I think, as the initial outlay, there's a huge amount of investment, both on resources, time, that's invested in pulling the data and understanding the data and building the visualizations. But that's your initial part that we found that will work quite well for us. So it takes a lot of planning. It takes a lot of time to develop these dashboards and these visualizations. But once you have that in place, it's sort of set in, if you build it with this intuitive mindset, as I've referred to earlier, it sort of is your 80 to 85% rule that's the way you'll look at the data, on an ongoing basis. So you've almost created that delivery upfront. So you don't actually need to go back to it. So right now, what we have in the group for group reporting in particular, we almost have one person that's building and maintaining this dashboard for us. But we've got 3 or 4 or 5 people actually just running around trying to understand the stories, trying to understand the data, trying to build the correlations between this data set, trying to understand how do we tell our story a little bit better, what has actually happened in the market, with our clients, internally with the business, that has led to the outcome that we're seeing, for example, for that month, or where we're forecasting to go for that year or the next 4 years, etc. So I think what I found is that, yes, there is an initial outlay of investment, but if you plan appropriately and you always have in mind what the end user actually wants to see and achieve with the data visualization that you're producing, then you start to spend much more time on the stories and understanding the data sets. And for us, what we're using, because we are quite SAP heavy, we're using Sap Analytics Cloud at the moment, which really is an amazing visualization tool that helps us connect our data across all the SAP products, as well as Microsoft products, as well as our reservoir or our data lakes. It's really been a new phenomenon for us in just stop doing PowerPoint presentations. You know, I think as finance people, we're just inundated with the amount of PowerPoint presentations that we do. And this is just a very clear, automated, dynamic way of reporting. If you can integrate all of your systems, you don't need to do any manual checks and reworks of data. As long as your systems are well governed and well audited, you know, you focus really on the front end of the information rather than spending inordinate amount of time on the back end.
All right, thanks for that, Nicole. Sam, I'm going to come to you as we wrap up on today's session. A couple of pointers for you. You may have touched on some of them, but just to keep on top of mind, what are your recommendations to finance professionals, CFOs, when they're dealing with DV?
Okay, thanks. Start with the questions that you want to answer, and then go back and get the data rather than the other way around. Don't start with the data and say, oh, this would look nice. Keep it simple. What are the 3 bullet points of the story that you want the data or the visualization to tell you? And then I think the final thing is this 5 why methodology. Really continue to ask why to get to the root cause of what the data is telling you in your performance.
All right, awesome. Ladies and gentlemen, our finance people on the call today are very shy, it seems, to come up with any questions, but a fantastic conversation to have you with me. Sam Hopwood from Mars, Gerhard Hartman from Sage, Nicole Daniels from Standard Bank, and Mohammed Mosam from Sage. Thank you very much. We've now just passed the top of the hour. It was great having you for a lovely session, and to all our attendees, thank you again for attending this session. It's been absolutely fantastic and informative. Guys, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.